My mother Sally was born in the East End of London in September 1908. This was during the Edwardian era, when horse-drawn carriages were being replaced by motorized vehicles, and the suffragettes were clamouring for votes for women. Her mother had arrived in England with her family during the past decade from Galina, a shtetl in Poland. From the Polish genealogical records, written by tradition in the Napoleonic style, her family can be traced back as living in Galina from the time of my mother's maternal great-grandmother's wedding. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were numerous shtetls in Eastern Europe. One of them was Przedzic, from where my mother's father came. Przedzic was situated only 70 kilometers by road from Galina. My grandfather arrived in England in 1906 after escaping from the Russian army. My mother's parents married in 1907 at the Cannon Street Road Synagogue. The photograph of a friend's wedding, taken around 1910, shows my mother's grandmother, her parents, and her mother's brothers and sisters. My mother's father was the only member of his family to go to England. The other members remained in Poland, and almost all were murdered in the Holocaust. The only extant pictures of my mother's cousins are found in some photographs in the Przedzic Yizko book. My mother was the firstborn of her family. Then her sisters Betty and Eunice were born, and finally a boy, Monty. My mother's first 5 years were spent in a house in Fenton Street, which is off the commercial road, and she, together with her family, then moved to West Arbor Street, where she lived for a period of about 20 years. In the early 1930s, my mother met my father, Philip Simons, a qualified accountant, and they were engaged in August 1932. They were married in October of the following year at the Stoke Newington Synagogue. Then came the food, and what a feast it was! A breakfast, a lunch, a dinner, and in addition refreshments before, in between, and after. Sadly, just a few months after her wedding, my mother's father died in his early 50s.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
2 months later, in November 1939, my parents moved to Harrowsmead, which is in Edgware, a northwest London suburb, where a few years earlier a Jewish community had been established. Our house was the last house to be built in Harrowsmead at that period. At first there was no garage, only a garden shed, and it was only at a later date that a garage was built. In 1942 I was born. Nearly 9 years later, my brother was born. We were a happy family. Both my brother and I had a solid Torah and secular education, and in later years my mother would proudly talk of her 2 rabbi doctors. My maternal grandmother always lived close to my mother. During her latter years, my grandmother became increasingly incapacitated, and my mother, as a dutiful daughter, would run 2 houses, her own and her mother's house. In 1957, my parents celebrated their silver wedding. At the celebratory dinner, my mother delivered a speech, which was, in those days, unusual for a woman to do. For nearly a quarter of a century, my mother was on the committee, usually as the catering chairman, of the local chapter of the Child Resettlement Fund, Emunah, which ran a number of children's homes in Israel. On going on Aliyah in 1978, she was presented with a certificate of recognition for her work. She also wrote during this period, on a voluntary basis, cookery recipes for this fund's newspaper, and over the course of nearly a decade, about 70 recipes, all of them her own family recipes, appeared. They used of all manner of foods, and they catered for every taste and diet. They included cakes, puddings, desserts, meat and fish dishes. Her recipes were very popular with the readers, and her gefilte fish recipe even resulted in a letter to the editor.
I thought my recipe for gefilte fish was the best, but after trying Mrs. Simon's, I must admit it was excellent, and a great improvement on any recipe that I have ever tried.
She became so well known that the newspaper decided to publish a profile of her. A few years before she died, a book was brought out containing all these recipes. In the mid-1960s, I went to Israel, and after the Six-Day War, joined the Hebron settlers. One of the settlers was Dina Abraham, who was then in charge of the community kitchen. In September 1969, we got married in Hebron. My parents and other members of the family came to Israel for the wedding. My mother's first grandchild was born in 1970. Eventually, she had 11 grandchildren. Sadly, in early 1975, my father died. 3 years later, my mother, then aged 70, went on Aliyah. She bought an apartment in Petach Tikva, the city where members of her family had lived since the 1920s. With her knowledge of Yiddish, she got on better with the clerks in government and municipal offices than native Hebrew speakers could. Almost every summer, she would go to England to visit her family and friends. Likewise, her two sisters would often come to Israel to visit her and her extended family. In 1981, my brother married Milka Hacker from Haifa. My mother lived in Petach Tikva until she was almost 90. An annex was then built to my apartment in Kiryat Arba, making a granny flat for her. At her suggestion, at the same time, a large patio was built adjoining this annex. Every Sukkot, this patio was converted into a large sukkah. This replaced the makeshift sukkah we had built each previous year. One of my mother's pastimes was Scrabble. Her first grandchild to marry was my daughter Shifra.
ואני בתקווה ובעזרת השם ואעבוד ואכבד ואאזון ואפרנס ואכלכל וארצה ואחסה אותך כמנהג האנשים.
In spite of her age, my mother danced with all her might at this wedding. The wedding almost corresponded with her 89th birthday, and during the course of the wedding dinner, the family made her a birthday celebration, with, of course, a birthday cake.
Dear Grandma, we want to wish you a very happy birthday and say thank you for all the good years that you have given us. And we also wish our grandfather could have been with us on this special day. But we also know that his spirit is among us and is happy for us. So Grandma, we hope to celebrate a lot more years with you in health and peace from your loving family.
A few months later, my oldest daughter, Ayelet, got married. For my mother's 90th birthday, my family made her a surprise party during Chol HaMoed Sukkot, which was just a few weeks after the date of her actual birthday. Her sisters, brother, and various cousins in England had been secretly alerted to this party, and it was arranged that when receiving a signal from the family in Israel, they would telephone her and wish her happy birthday. Suddenly, my mother received telephone call after telephone call in the space of a few minutes. An album of This Is Your Life had also been prepared and was given to her. This album was then constantly updated throughout her lifetime. The next grandchild to get married was Hadassah.
הרי את מקודשת לי וטבעת זו כדת משה וישראל. מקודשת.
The date also corresponded to my mother's 92nd birthday, and she was again given a birthday cake. For her 95th birthday, a party was made for her, again in the sukkah.
Who made this cake? No, that's a shop lady.
The food was delicious, even after falling on the floor. As the proverb goes, waste not, want not. A few months before she died, my mother attended the wedding of my brother's daughter Noah. Even though she was already 98, she danced magnificently. My mother was also privileged to attend the Brit Milah of one of her grandsons and also of her two oldest great-grandsons. My mother had great affection for all her 11 grandchildren and 9 great-grandchildren. her great-grandchildren would reciprocate by sending her their drawings. She also merited participating in a whole variety of family simchas.
There must be.
Grandma, what have you got to say to your great-granddaughter?
Well, wish her a happy birthday, with many, many happy returns of the day. Grow up a healthy, happy girl.
כאשר הייתי בת חודשיים, הגיעה לארץ לביקור אחות של סבתא רבא, גרמו, ושמה אונטי בטי, וזכיתי אף להצטלם איתה. מה? יש מלא שם, על יד התנור. הגיל לא משנה בכלל, העיקר שיהיה גם טוב וגם מזל. תצטלי, a very happy and first joyous birthday with love from great grandma.
Even in her 90s, my mother would join in the various festival activities with her family, including the Lag BaOmer bonfire and the Purim celebrations, where at least she would give the impression that she was drinking. We must also not forget how at the Seder night, after the children had sung the Manish Tana, it became a tradition for my mother to translate it into Yiddish, as she had done when she had been a small girl. My mother reached her 99th birthday and received many greetings on the occasion. She would often say that her wish was that when the time came for her to leave this world, she would just fall asleep. Her time came that Chol HaMoed Sukkot, and as she had wished, after a very happy last day with many visitors, she suddenly went into her final sleep. The inscription on her tombstone sums up her life, the righteous woman who went to her final destination at a ripe old age, in her 100th year, with the kiss of death of the righteous. A woman of valor who can find, for her price is far above rubies. It was appropriate that she spent her last hour on earth sitting in the sukkah, which she had planned nearly 10 years earlier.
Eishes chayim yimtza v'rachoik mipni micha batach balei bala v'shala lo yechsar gimelasu toy v'lo ira kol yemei chayeha darshat tzemer ufishtim v'taz b'chefetz kapeha Hai sakayni ay soicher Mimelchak tavi lachma Vatakam beod laila Vatiten teref levesa Vechok lenaroseha Zame masade vatikachehu Mipricha peanatakarem